Hi there, it's Sarah here from BJC Health, coming to you from Sydney, Australia. Thanks for showing an interest in one of our educational events. You're about to watch part one, so enjoy the event. If you've got any questions about the content, then please consider joining BJC Connect, where you can access all of our facilitators live. Otherwise, please consider leaving a comment and we'll do our best to get back to you.
Okay, so yeah, when we posed this topic a while ago, we weren't sure whether it'd be interesting. And then secondly, when I started to put this together, I wasn't quite sure how to pitch this, because obviously you could talk for hours upon hours upon hours about clinical trials, but that would just bore people stiff. So I've tried to keep it relevant to what you may be interested in, but also give you an overview to try and understand why clinical trials are done and what information you try to get from it and how doctors may interpret clinical trials, so that if you ever come across studies or things, news items, you might have some appreciation for what's gone into it. So I'm going to go through why do we need trials, what are randomized clinical trials, which are the important ones, why they're so complicated, lengthy, and costly, who's sort of involved and who you might meet along the way if you're in a clinical trial, how they're run, and if you're a patient, what's involved in it, how are trial results reported, which is what you hear as the headlines with news or press releases, or in journal articles, and just some common questions that patients ask about trials to us a lot. So I thought people would have the same questions. So, but yeah, there may be things I don't cover or things I confuse people with. So I will explain as needed. So what is a clinical trial? So a clinical trial is really a research study where people volunteer to test new treatments, interventions, or tests. And so they aim to determine if it's safe, effective, or potentially better than existing treatments. So there's a lot there, really, and I'll go through some of that. But clinical trials can involve drugs, which is medication. So that's usually in rheumatology, what we're after, the medications. But it can be devices like pacemakers or knee replacements, or it could be procedures, whether one procedure is better than another. It could be psychology interventions, or it could just be prevention strategies on how to prevent diseases or conditions. So there's many, many different ways you can run a trial. So if specifically for rheumatology, we're mostly talking about medications for our diseases. So really, what information do you want to obtain from a clinical trial? So really, you want to know, does the medication work? What is the correct dose to give to people? Is it better than existing treatments? And are there any side effects or safety concerns? So that's broadly what you want to try and get from a clinical study. So I'll spend a little bit of time on this because how a drug is developed is something that I think a lot of people don't quite appreciate particularly well. Um, when a drug is marketed and is available, it's always after a phase 3 study. Okay, so phase 4 is after it's on market and people are already taking it, but there's a whole lot of research development that goes to getting a drug to market. And actually, the reason why medications are expensive is an average cost of a drug is about $1 billion from start to finish to bring it to market. So obviously, pharma companies have to earn a lot of money to recoup development costs. And so they also have to be very selective on where they spend their money. So early development and preclinical research is beginning. That's basically science research. So it's done in a laboratory. They might be working on different molecules or trying to understand diseases and trying to work out how to treat them. And then they may treat rats or baboons or something like that, or mice, to get an understanding of how a drug works in a living organism. Then if it looks promising, and often that goes on for years, many years, then if it looks promising, you go to phase 1 studies. And that's really what you'd call first in human studies. So these are typically small numbers, 1 to 2 dozen people. They're often completely healthy people, and they may be paid to be part of studies. And these are often done in hospitals because you're giving a medication to humans for the first time. You're never quite sure what to expect. And so people are monitored very closely to make sure there's no untoward outcomes. So here they're trying to work out what the correct dose is as well, like how does a human respond to it and what's the correct dose. If you then think it's promising, you might go to a phase 2 study where you get maybe up to 100 participants. And this is where you're trying to work out if the medication is going to be effective or not. And so you're basically doing scoping studies to see if it's worth going to the phase 3 level. And so usually in this phase 2, you're choosing people with the disease that you're interested in studying, and you would give the treatment and work out roughly what dose. So they're often called dose studies, you're trying to work out what dose. And phase 3 is the big studies, which we're often doing at BJC, although we have done some phase 2 studies. But phase 3 is the big one. So that's where you get often more than 100 participants, usually many hundreds. Some of the cardiology ones, they're in thousands, for instance. And they're usually multinational if these are big studies. So a lot of the studies we're in, there might be 50 countries and 100 different sites, and they're sponsored by a big pharmaceutical company. And here they're comparing it to existing treatments or to placebo. They're trying to prove that it's better. They're often doing studies to look at long-term safety as well. And that's the really big one, which if that passes the rigorous test, that's when they submit it to the medications authorities, like the TGA in Australia or the FDA in America, and that's where they apply to get it marketed to be given more broadly to humans. And then after it's been marketed, they often do phase 4 where these are basically where they get thousands of people, and they're not doing trying to see if it works. They've already proven that. They're often checking for long-term safety, so making sure there's no concerns coming up along the way about safety. And so these go on for many years, and that's how we get our longer term information. So broadly speaking, that's how it works. I mean, I sort of raise this because people come into the clinic and say, "Oh, did you hear the news about this, breakthrough thing or whatever?" And the news is, they often talk about early phase discoveries, like literally it's something they've discovered in a rat or it's this news grab that they do. And it's like it's years to get through these phases to humans. And so, you kind of know what's going through the phases. So generally you have some sort of a pipeline of knowing what's going on in the next 5 years or so. And a lot of these news items are just, they give people the wrong impression about what might be available in the near future. So a randomized controlled trial is one of what you call the gold standard. And this is what a lot of the phase 3 studies are. And this is because it tends to give the best evidence of proof that it works. And so you may have heard these terms about double-blinded, placebo-controlled, randomized clinical trial. That's what we'd call the gold standard. They're often the trials that we participate in. And so what does all that mean? So double blind means two people, which the patient and the investigator or most of the study staff don't know what treatment you're on. So there might be a placebo group or there might be an active treatment group or different doses, but you don't know. You can't tell. It looks identical. And so that's reducing the risk of bias that you're expecting a response to treatment. And placebo-controlled means one group usually is a placebo. So if it's a medication, it's a tablet, but it's got nothing of active ingredients in it. So they often call that a sugar pill. It's not actually sugar, but that's what they call it. Or it might be, if it's an injection, it'd literally be saline, which is salt water. So no active ingredients. And for instance, in surgical trials, they may actually do what they call sham surgery, where they actually make a cut, they go in, they fiddle around, not causing any harm, and they close up. So the patient doesn't know whether they've had surgery or not. And that's called sham surgery, and that would be placebo. And so this again allows for a comparison group. So whether you truly get a response to the treatment that you're looking at. And then there's randomization. And I've got a couple of pictures here to explain this as well. But it's basically where you get your pool of people and you are randomly put into either the treatment group or the control group, and a computer does that. So there's no bias. It's not a human selecting, like I can't choose which group you go in. Basically, you just plug in the patient's ID number because names are not used. There's an ID number, and they might want certain information like what medication this person's on. and then they'll just say this group, and it's completely randomly generated. And so there you're trying to minimize bias to make sure that the differences are true differences and that you get a random mix of people in each group. So that's what we call an RCT. So this is what randomization is. So two different slides to look at. So you get your, on the left, you get your pool of patients, which is the pink bubble here. Then you put these people into a computer and they split them into group A or group B randomly. And so group A will take this treatment, group B will take this treatment. And so over here, you can see the treatment group, you follow them up over time, the control group, you follow them up over time, and then you compare whether that treatment group is done better in whatever way you're studying than the control group. And so this is regarded as the gold standard way to get the best, most accurate results. And so these are actual pictures from the medications we've got in a couple of trials. So, a patient, what would happen is we might have a patient, 26802. I know who that patient is. Nobody else does. So that's how confidentiality is. And the computer says for patient 26802, you need to dispense this medication, 2230616. The packaging looks identical. The tablets look identical. Or the injection looks identical, and we give that one to that person. And so the central panel will know which number has got which treatment and so forth. But yeah, it's the participant taking it, you can't tell what you're taking. And this is a tablet on the left. Again, we might be told that participant needs to take bottle 787130. And so that's what we dispense. Yeah, so it's not no names. And so this is broadly, you could talk for hours on this slide because this is what people talk about with what if you call evidence-based medicine. And so randomized controlled trials are one of the highest quality, so you can trust the results very well. A systematic review is where you get a group of randomized controlled trials and put them together and analyze that. But then right down the bottom is editorials and expert opinion, where some expert says, oh, I think, this is better than that. That's regarded as the lowest quality of evidence. And then you've got a variety of other types of studies where you might observe people over time. So they're more observational studies rather than interventional studies. And so a lot of, you hear again in a lot of the supplement industry, they always say, oh, trials support, this product or whatever. And, often the trials are what we call very low quality trials. So they're, set up because you can set a trial up to get the result you want, basically. And so there's what you call a high risk of bias. So you don't set it up with proper randomization, you don't set it up with proper blinding. And so you get results that are muddy. And so you can trust that less, that what the results you get are the true results. So you always look for doctors always look for the quality of the trial as well, how well they've achieved, all these aims. So to do a randomized control trial, it's very hard, it's very complicated, and not only just the administration of running, 100 different sites around the world and making sure that every site is basically doing everything the same, like I mean everything the same. They have to make sure it's safe, right? Because obviously you're giving medications, you're not perfectly sure what results you're going to get or if there's any concerns. So you got to make sure it's safe for everyone. So there's so many checks and balances along the way to make sure it's safe. Lots of tests, lots of processes, steps along the way where all this is done. And so that involves a lot of bureaucracy, lots of paperwork, lots of emails, like a ridiculous number of emails. And yeah, so you're trying to get the information that the results are accurate and can be trusted and that it's safe for patients. So I'll spend a little bit of time here. So when you run a clinical trial and you're trying to make everything the same, there's an approved trial protocol. And so if anyone has been in a trial, you'll often hear people say, oh, I'll have to look at the protocol because basically everything that happens in a trial has to be done by the protocol. And this is done to be made sure that it's safe. So a trial protocol's about 150, 200 pages, and it lists anything and everything about the trial. And this has all been approved by ethics committees who've made sure it's safe and everything. And so everything has to be run through the protocol. So At the bottom, the protocol will define why you're doing the trial and what the aims are, so what you're studying. It'll outline the design, so exactly what's going to happen, what happens at each step, each visit, and what each site is going to do to follow this protocol. It will include who's allowed to go in the study. So this is one of the hard things about studies is getting the right people in studies because there's long lists of who they want and who they don't want. For various reasons, you do that. But you try and get a pure population so you can study it closely. And then it'll talk about what the treatment is and what procedures are involved at each step of the way. Then there'll be a lot on safety and monitoring and to ensure that it's done correctly. What are the steps involved to make sure it's not going to be a problem for patients? And then with all this data and information, how it's getting handled, how it's stored, how it's going to be analyzed at the end. And these are all pre-specified. It's not made up along the way. It's all specified before the trial starts. So the trials are very dense reading. So who's involved? So the clinical investigator, I'm usually at BJC, the clinical investigator. And so that's usually a doctor at the center of it all. And there's a whole bunch of other groups. The trial participant is one of the groups involved, right? So that's where you as a patient would be. But basically the sponsor is the pharmaceutical company. So, you've probably heard of them, some of them, Pfizer, Johnson and Johnson, AbbVie. They are the ones that own the product and are doing the study. So they design the protocol. But once that protocol's in action, they don't have the hands-on control of it because they will pay for it, but they have to be sort of at an arm's length as well. So they often contract research organizations to make sure everything's run correctly and smoothly according to the protocol. And they're the ones who might come on site and monitor us quite closely. So we get monitored really closely to make sure we're doing the correct thing every step of the way. Before we can start a study, it's already gone to an ethics committee. Ethics committee is made up of a group of people who look at all of this to make sure the study protocol is going to be safe, there's adequate monitoring, and there's adequate study of it. So there might be an institution. I mean, I guess for us that's BJC because there's other groups involved at BJC that need to be aware of what we're studying and that we've got all the resources available. The trial protocol is usually approved by the drug authorities. This is an American slide, so the FDA in America often will approve a protocol before you even start it because they want to be sure that the information they're going to get at the end is what they actually want to know to be able to approve the product. And research protections groups might have a look at it, and third-party vendors, that might be pathology or radiology groups that are contracted to do some of the studies. So who might you meet if you're a patient on site? Well, you'd usually meet the doctor. In fact, you have a lot of interaction with the doctor, which they're either called the principal investigator or the sub-investigator, and they're involved with the medical side of the running of the trial to make sure it's done correctly. But ultimately, they're in charge of how everything runs on site. The study coordinators, we've got two at BJC. And they do all the day-to-day runnings of the study, liaising with patients, making sure the study runs smoothly, huge amount of behind-the-scenes work. There may be data entry people because of the huge amount of data that you have. You obviously have to have some sort of pharmacy or some way of storing medications correctly. And you need some way of collecting pathology and sending it off as well. So we've got all of that at BJC. And what are some of the offsite groups involved? So when pathology is taken, it's actually not sent to one of the local laboratories. It's usually sent overseas. So it gets shipped off that afternoon, and nearly always to Singapore, because Singapore is nearly always the hub for Asia Pacific. So all the Asia Pacific sites will send their results to Singapore, and it's all done with a standardized way. There might be certain places you have to use for radiology if the study needs that. You have to have a pharmacy involved. We do our own pharmacy, but a hospital would have their own pharmacy, for instance. There's trial monitors. They're the ones who come and literally make sure we dot the I's and cross the T's and run everything exactly to protocol. There's the trial managers who oversee all the admin side of things to make sure that the trial's running smoothly. The medical monitors is someone who I would deal with. So if I've got a medical concern or medical question about a patient, I would have to run it past the medical monitor. They may be in Australia, but they're usually based overseas. And so that's often by email, occasionally by a Zoom meeting if there's a particular concern about how a patient's going or some question that needs answering. And then there's a whole lot of data managers because um, a ridiculous amount of data is obtained from a clinical trial because they try and capture everything. So they're huge, huge setups, many, many people involved. So very broadly, who who is selected for a clinical trial? And so this is as a patient, are you able to go into a clinical trial? So the protocol will always list what group of patients they're trying to study. And so there'll be both inclusion and exclusion criteria. So this can be long. So one of the studies we're running has 12 pages of this, like of detailed lines about who can and can't go on a study. So that's why they can be hard to select the right people. Um, but the average study is probably 6 pages long. And so they would list what disease you're studying, how to define what disease that patient have, what age groups. Maybe it might be involved, you have to have tried certain medications, but you can't have other medications. And then very broadly, they might say who can't participate. And so this is where it can be a problem because often patients will be excluded if there's certain medications that they're on or if they've got certain diseases. And one of the issues is, if you've had a cancer in the last 5 years, almost every single study will exclude you. If you've had major cardiovascular disease, you'll be excluded. If you've got a lot of other issues, you'd be excluded because they don't really want to take a risk of giving a medication to someone who has health issues because they don't always know how it's going to interact. But that has problems down the track when you're trying to interpret results because you've only got a smaller group of patients in the study than what you might be treating day to day. So if you're a participant, what kind of happens to you? So I'll go through sort of some of the things as a patient that you might be exposed to. So broadly speaking, I've broken it down into the steps of a patient's involvement would be pre-screening, screening, day one visit, and ongoing visits. So pre-screening is really where we're looking for patients, right? So we've got studies that we're trying to look for patients for, and we make sure we know all the referring doctors have some idea of what studies we're looking for, and we're on the lookout for suitable patients for this study, so we can at least talk to them to see whether they're interested. I generally try to choose studies where there's a benefit for the patient and not just studies for the, study's sake. And so it might be early access to a medication or, treatment for a disease we don't have good treatment for. So we try to choose studies like that. And so what might be involved there is the doctor might speak to me and say, I've got a patient who's, might be a candidate, and I would review to see if, all this 6 pages of inclusion, exclusion criteria is potentially met. So then if it looks like that might be the case, patients would come in for a screening visit. And this might take 2 or 3 hours. You do lots of questions, physical examination, blood tests, and you're trying to work out if every single one of those criteria is met and whether they can go into the study. And if all of those criteria are met, they're booked in for the day one visit where the study actually begins. And then there's ongoing visits, which are specified by the protocol as to how often they may be. So in a bit more detail, what does it involve? So pre-screenings, usually there's some sort of file review where you might look through the file to see if, there's certain things that are flagged, whether they can or can't go into the study. It may involve a phone call or an email just to clarify a couple of things to see if that's basically if it's worthwhile for them to come in for the screening visit. Because I don't want to waste people's time coming in for 2 or 3 hours only to be told, sorry, you don't meet criteria. And we should have looked at that before. And there's always an information sheet. These are often quite dense. They contain huge amounts of information. So they're usually about 25 pages long that we usually send out for people to have a read. Some people read all of it, most don't, but some people highlight things. It's very impressive. So Yeah, and so that's basically getting everyone up to speed about what might be involved. And then at the screening visit, so here I would go through, this is what I do, I would go through the study and explain what we're doing and what's involved. And usually I've done that on a phone call beforehand. And then if they're agreeable, would sign a consent form, which means we can start everything else in the study. And here I would spend an hour and a half taking a very detailed medical history, examination, everything medically you'd want to find out, because we have to record that, but also I have to need to know whether it would be suitable for the study or whether there'd be any safety concerns. And there may be specific things we have to do. For instance, in rheumatology, we do joint counts. We might look at skin for psoriasis. We might look at other specific observations like spine scores or things like that. You do some basic observations. Nearly always there's always blood tests. There may be, it may or may not be radiology. And as I said, the aim is to determine if you're eligible for the study and whether you can proceed. So the day one visit, again, is another 2 or 3 hour visit usually. And this is where the trial begins. So often there's quite extensive examination and specific measurements we do because that's what we're comparing to. That's the beginning of the study. So we want something that's accurate that we can compare to for the end of the study. So again, lots of pathology is taken. And then if everything is good, you're randomized so that we plug into the computer that we're ready to dispense the medication, and the computer will come back and say, yep, for this patient, give them this medication. And then we dispense it and give the medication, and then the study begins. And then there'll be ongoing visits. This depends on the study, often monthly, but it may progress to every 3 monthly as the trial goes on. Sometimes it's a little more frequent as well. The trial length varies from a few months to 3 or more years. Okay, so some of them are quite big commitments. We've got a couple of 3 year studies at the moment. So it is quite a long commitment for everyone involved. And so each visit usually involves a visit. Well, it's always involved a visit with the investigator, which is the doctor. Again, you go through the medication history. We record anything and everything that happens health-wise, anything that happens in adverse events. So if you stub your toe, we record that because you're trying to record as much information because they're trying to work out if there's any long-term issues. But and if you get admitted to hospital for any reason, for instance, we've had people admitted to hospital with back pain, and that gets reported as a serious adverse event because it's a hospitalization. Even though in all likelihood it's got absolutely nothing to do with the study medication, it will still get reported, and that analysis is done down the track to see whether that's relevant or not. Because who knows? Say you've got a new medication, and in the intervention group, there's way more people getting admitted for back pain. That's a totally unexpected outcome. So you report everything and then you analyze later down the track. And so nearly every trip on site will involve examination, joint counts, pathology, medication administration. So just to give you some idea of the setup that you have to run a clinical trial. So on the top left is our trial fridge. So this has to be it has to be closely between 3 to 8 degrees. You would think your fridge at home's pretty good. We tried doing that just using a standard fridge. It's amazing how inaccurate it is. So we upgraded to a $2,000 medical fridge, and this is brilliant. It saved our life. So basically, if your medication goes out of that range, you often have to chuck the medication, get a new lot in because they have to be sure that it's kept at the right level. So again, we've got a medical grade freezer, which keeps it at -20 degrees for storing specimens. We've got about 6 lockup cupboards for all our information that we have to keep, folders and folders and folders. And this is our big beast on the right, the -60 degree freezer for deep freezing specimens. Yeah, that's a very heavy fridge. We barely got it into the place at Parramatta. So we've got an ECG machine, so we had to learn how to do ECGs. We've got a centrifuge machine because when we take bloods, we have to spin bloods down before sending them off. We've got an incubator machine here in the middle, which certain tests you got to keep the blood at a certain temperature for a certain length of time to get the right results. Sharps bins, pipettes for all the blood sampling that you have to do and analyze before it's shipped off. And that's just that's just one patient with all the different tubes for that study.
So you've just finished watching part 1 of one of our recent educational events. Hope you enjoyed the content. If you'd like to access part 2, then you need to sign up for BJC Connect. It's a free platform where you can access not just the recordings of past events, but also access a whole range of upcoming future events and access our team of facilitators live. All of the details that you need to join BJC Connect are now flashing up on your screen. But otherwise, like our staff, subscribe if you'd like to see more information from BJC Health. Look forward to seeing you in an event soon.